Okay. So when you read an article like this, a nonfiction text like this, one of the biggest, I guess, most impactful strategies to help you understand what you just read is called the three close read strategy. You might have learned about this before. We've actually done it in class before. In the first read, you just preview and you skim for the gist of what the article is about. So you just kind of look at the article and kind of evaluate headings and photographs that the article has. Whatever the author kind of makes stand out is what's most important. So you kind of just look around and see, okay, well, it's going to be about this. It's got a map here. It's got this image. You kind of just keep going and get the general idea of what the article is first, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of scrolling through it to show you what it's about, right? It's got Darfur and Rakhine. In this phase, you don't really do a lot of reading. You just kind of do a lot of skimming and a lot of glancing around to see what's in the article, right? So there it is. And then in the second read, what you do is that you actually kind of start looking for key ideas and you start understanding content. Excuse me. In this one specifically, the authors also recommend that you jot down any vocab you see that is unfamiliar to you. And while I'm not going to make you answer these 5 questions here, I wrote them down on cards for myself so that I could kind of keep track of what I'm reading as main ideas, right? So these 5 questions are centered around the 5 main ideas in this article. And I wrote them down on cards, and I'm just kind of going to remind you every now and then of the main ideas as we read. I'm not going to read all of it with you because I am going to leave some of the reading to you, but I am going to read part of it. And I'm mainly going to focus on those first 3, 4 questions that are on that list right here. But when you read at this point, you're looking more closely to find answers, right? And then finally, on the third reading, it's more like evaluating what you just read and trying to make connections with other content that you've looked at before, right? That's what these authors recommend on the third reading. And they even recommend you thinking about these 2 big questions at the end. Again, I'm not making you answer these questions on paper. I'm just having you tell me what you learned, right? So now that you know what to look for, it says here, remember to return to these questions once you finish reading. I know not all of you will read like this when you're reading nonfiction, but it's something that it does take a little more effort to do, but it's something that pays off really well in the end because it helps you understand readings a whole lot better than if you just give one quick read and you forget about everything you just read. So this is the kind of thing that I do when I read nonfiction text. I don't do the 3 reads like they suggest, but I do a more close read the second time. I still do that first glance reading. I've literally gone through 2 master's degrees that way, guys. I didn't read most of the class readings really carefully. I actually skimmed and got the gist of most readings like that in my undergrad. But when I went to graduate school to get a master's degree, I did do a whole lot more of that close reading. And so that's what I recommend you do at least. At least do the first glance through and then the second closer read, because that helps you really make connections to the content that you're learning. Okay. All right. That was all introduction. I want to actually read part of this with you. And I want to show you how it relates to those main ideas that are on these cards. Okay. So the first thing that the authors do here when they introduce this article to you is they tell you, why does genocide still happen? Okay, so this is a photograph here of the Holocaust Memorial. Okay, and the caption here by Bennett Sherry says, after the Holocaust, the world vowed never again to permit the crime of genocide. In the many decades since, though, genocide and mass violence have played out again and again. Why is that? That's what the main idea of this whole article is. Why does this still keep happening? So if you've never heard about the genocide in the Holocaust is probably the most remembered type of genocide in our history of humanity. This is not just the history of the United States, but the history of the world. And ever since World War II, as the author suggests there's been many more cases of genocides as well. And if you don't know what genocide is, this is when a group of people are systematically eliminated by either another group or by a government. And so what this article is going to be about, as you saw in the skimming, is why this keeps happening and where it has happened again. Okay? So as I'm reading here with you, I hope you remember what I said here. I hope you remember that I'm going to keep coming back to these main ideas. Okay? So the first section here is telling you what historians think is happening. And then in the next one, they're actually going to focus on a case study here in Cambodia and Iraq. And that's the last one that I'm going to read here with you. Okay. So let's take a look. Never again. Historian Samuel Moyn has called human rights the moral lingua franca of the international community. That is, all countries speak the language of human rights. As you've read, the international horror at Nazi atrocities during World War II is what many historians say led to the rise of human rights. As knowledge of the Holocaust spread, the world promised never again. In the decades since the Holocaust, our species has walked the moon and created the internet. Yet we've made no progress stopping genocide. The military in Myanmar is, at the time of this writing in 2019, committing genocide against the Rohingya people, a Muslim minority in that country. Since World War II in Cambodia, Iraq, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, and many other places, people have committed genocide and mass violence against civilians. Why does this genocide still happen? And a better question might be, why is genocide not prevented? So think about what the authors are starting with here before they introduce you to the actual cases of genocide. They're telling you about all the advancements we've made as humanity. And then they tell you about how it's still happening, about how still people are killing each other in these mass murders, these mass cases of violence, and how it's mostly happening in places around the world that are attacking minorities. Okay? Now, because it's happening in this way, the authors also suggest that that's why we've started focusing on human rights. In other words, as governments of more developed countries, we're focusing on the rights of people in more violent nations and nations with a lot more instability and possible genocide. Right? So the authors show you an image here that says a memorial at Dachau concentration camp with the words "Never Again" written in 5 different languages. Genocide is organized murder. There are many conditions that leaders must exploit when they start killing civilians within the borders of their country. However, it is the indifference or the collaboration of people in other countries that allows genocide to continue. So let's pause here because the authors just offered us a reason why it keeps happening. The authors say that it's the indifference and the collaboration that other countries have towards that genocide that allows it to happen. In this article, they're actually going to show you how the US had that kind of indifference towards 2 different places, towards Cambodia and Rwanda, and how that's why in those 2 places genocide happened. Protection of national sovereignty has repeatedly trumped the lives of civilians. In most cases, the great powers of the world and the United Nations have either failed to act or acted to fail. I love this. The authors are suggesting to you that in the next few paragraphs, you're going to be reading about cases in which the US, in order to protect the sovereignty of a nation, in order to not invade a nation, we allowed those nations by consequence to kill people in the minority. And how that kind of indifference is what led to those cases of genocide to happen. So they say finally here, organized violence against groups of people is common to most places and time periods. You've read about the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century, but in the second half of the 20th century, the international community reaffirmed the dignity and worth of the human person in the United Nations Charter. The UN passed the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide in 1948. But it was not enforced until 50 years later when the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda tried those responsible for the Rwandan genocide. Cambodia, Iraq, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Rwanda, Sudan, and Myanmar were all party to the convention, while genocides occurred within their borders. So this is what the authors are trying to show you guys. The irony that even though some of these countries promised not to kill people within their boundaries, they still did. Think about what they're telling you here. They're telling you that even though there's a law in the books, countries don't respect that law and still murder people within their boundaries, within their borders. So that's what this whole article is going to be about. It's going to tell you about these 5 specific cases here that you see highlighted, these 6 or 5 specific cases that you see here. Cambodia, Iraq, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Rwanda, Sudan, and Myanmar. And it's going to tell you why it keeps happening in these places. But it's going to have a specific focus on the indifference that countries like the US have had towards those places. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read this one about Cambodia and Iraq, and then I'm going to leave the rest for you to be reading and for you to be telling me what connections you made and what things you're learning about. Okay? All right. So if you're like me and you like to take notes, I like to use cards like these, okay, when I write notes. Take some notes, especially because right now I'm going to talk about the role of the US in Cambodia. So I'm going to talk about that main idea here on number 1. Okay? All right, let's take a look at it. Let me just get a sip of drink here. So, Cambodia and Iraq, genocide during the Cold War. By the way, sometimes I like to take headings like this and make questions out of them, especially like if I have an assignment about a question. Like this would be a great question to put there, right? What was the Cambodia and Iraq genocide like? Why was it during the Cold War? Or what happened in Cambodia and Iraq? Something like that. You know what I mean? That way I kind of prime my brain for what's coming in the reading. In 1975, the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, the military government, killed 1.7 million people, 21% of the country's population. Boom, right out of the gate, the authors give you a really compelling topic sentence. They tell you that in 1975, this military government in Cambodia killed 1.7 million people. That's amazing. Political scientist Carl D. Jackson claims that the Cambodian genocide was the greatest per capita loss of a single nation in the 20th century. In other words, that government killed more people than any other nation in the 20th century. That's unprecedented, guys. This is like historic. This is a map of all of the states, by the way, that have participated in that genocide convention of the UN. These are the countries that promised not to kill people within their borders. Okay? And many of these countries still did it regardless. Okay? To understand why the Cambodian genocide started and why no one stopped it, you must understand the American war with Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, the US military bombed Cambodia to kill North Vietnamese guerrilla fighters that were hiding in the countryside. And they killed Cambodian citizens or civilians in the process. So the authors are telling you that the Cambodian genocide is tied to the war that the US had going on in Vietnam, a neighboring country, a country right next door to Cambodia. Many survivors joined the rebel group known as the Khmer Rouge, fighting against the US-backed Cambodian government. So think about what I'm telling you here. The US is bombing Cambodia because it's trying to find North Vietnamese guerrilla fighters there. And so many people die there that some of the survivors decide to form a rebel group that is going to destroy the government that helped the US bomb Cambodia. Led by a former school teacher who called himself Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge seized control of Phnom Penh, which is Cambodia's capital, in 1975. They quickly sought to eliminate anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution, especially targeting ethnic and religious minorities. So think about what the initial goal was, guys. The initial goal was to take over the government, destroy it, and then stop the US bombings of Cambodia. But look at how quickly it turned around. That military government started eliminating one that was an enemy of that cause, and especially ethnic and religious groups that were not with that cause. So this image you see on the screen is an American B-52 bomber that was dropping bombs in Cambodia on 1969. When the United States found out about this, by the way, that we were bombing Cambodia rather than just bombing Vietnam, a lot of people lost trust in the American government. President Nixon, for example, was really criticized because of the bombing of Cambodia that took place when he was president. And the president justified it as saying that everything that we were doing there in that area was justified because we had to stop the Vietnamese. Anyway, the UN knew of these atrocities early on. Why did no international force act to stop it? The 5 members of the UN Security Council, the US, the Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain, they had the power to stop this. However, any member of the Security Council can veto an action by the UN. In other words, they can stop the UN from doing anything. However, both the Soviet Union and China refused to violate Cambodia's national sovereignty through UN intervention. That means they refused to invade Cambodia. And these major powers had their own repressive regimes in Eastern Europe and Tibet. That means China and the Soviet Union both had regions of their own nations that they were controlling with repressive regimes. That means with governments that control the people there. They feared a yes vote might set a precedent that could eventually hurt their own interests in those regions. Beyond the inaction of the UN, the US and China both actively supported the Khmer Rouge. When Vietnam, America's former enemy, invaded Cambodia in 1979 to put an end to that genocide, the US actually aided the Khmer Rouge, that military government. The United States actually gave them weapons and money. President Jimmy Carter said that the United States was choosing the lesser evil. And then I love how the narrators put this paragraph. They say, this parentheses, they say, yes, just 3 paragraphs ago in 1975, the Khmer Rouge saw the US as the enemy, but things change fast in war and in politics. So just to give you a recap here, guys, and initially the Khmer Rouge was against the US, but by 1979, just 4 years later, they were willing to help the US. Excuse me. Yeah. 4,000 miles away from Cambodia, and only a few years later, the Iraqi government, led by Saddam Hussein, launched a campaign to kill and subdue Iraq's Kurdish population. So this is point number 2 here on my card, the Iraqi mass killings. The Kurds were a large ethnic group minority who lived in the land where Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq border each other. In the 1980s, almost a quarter of Iraq's 18 million people were Kurds. The Iraqi government claimed its attacks were aimed at the Kurdish terrorists they said that were helping Iran attack Iraq. Hussein's military murdered and displaced tens of thousands of Kurdish men, women, and children. Their weapon of choice? Poison gas. When we found out that Saddam Hussein was doing this to his own people, that's one of the reasons why we invaded Iraq in the 90s during Operation Desert Storm, guys. That's one of the reasons why we were there in that area, because we knew of this history that Saddam Hussein had in poisoning his own people. As in Cambodia, 2 members of the UN Security Council supported the state committing genocide. Both the Americans and the Soviets provided financial and military aid to Iraq in its war against Iran. The Americans eventually worked with the UN to protect civilians, but that was only after 100,000 Iraqi Kurdish refugees crossed the border into Turkey, an American ally. This right here, homies, these are shoes that were exhumed. That means they were dug up from a mass grave in Iraq. These are from the Anfal genocide, from the genocide of those Kurdish people there in Iraq. As you can tell, there were children among those people who were murdered. This right here is a shape of the country of Cambodia with human remains. This is a map of Cambodia made by the bones of victims of the Khmer Rouge, which was hung in Tuol Seng Museum of Genocide in Cambodia from 1979 to the year 2002. So this is where I stopped, guys, but these were the main points that I talked about, just so you remember. I just talked about the Iraqi mass killings. I talked about the role of the U.S. in the mass killings there in Cambodia. And then I introduced you to why this is still happening. Why is genocide still happening? Okay. So now I want to hear from you. I want you to make connections here. So I'm going to stop the recording here.